This is something that happened over the course of a few nights while I was staying at an Airbnb in Norway last month. The person who rented the property to me had to have known, and since this night they've deleted their Airbnb account. On the first night I was there, at around 11 p.m. I heard it. It was a knock on the front door. A single deliberate knock. I was in the bedroom reading when I heard it. The front door had had a peephole at one time, because the spot where it had been in the door remained, but it had been plastered up. I called out, "Yes?" but was answered with only the sound of the night beyond the door. I waited a few seconds more before opening the door. Outside the house there was nothing but the leaves in the massive oak trees rustling and the soft glowing light of the lamppost in the street just past the driveway. Concluding that the noise was just the wind, I shut the door and didn't give it a second thought. Now something confused me about all of this. I'd come to realize that I hadn't actually heard any bird life since I arrived, which was odd considering the abundance of trees favorable to avian species. The following night at around the same time came the sound of another knock at the door. Like the previous night, there was only one knock. I paused my reading, set the book down in my lap and waited. A few seconds passed, then a minute. I remember the air becoming colder as if a window had been opened, but all the windows were shut. No further sound came from the door, but just as I picked up my book again to continue reading, there was another knock. This time it was heavier, more insistent, as if the knocker knew I was in another room and wanted to make certain that I'd heard it. I got out of bed feeling annoyed more than anything, and raised my voice louder than before. "Yes?" No reply. This time, though, there was something different in the air around the doorway. There was a tension around it, a flexing of the air, a tightness of anticipation of something waiting just outside. It was also freezing cold. My fear subordinated this to anger. "Who is it?" I demanded. Receiving no reply, I ripped open the door, and as I did so there was a sound in the grass of the lawn. It was the sound of running footsteps over the grass in all directions. The grass on the lawn moved as well. However, there was no breeze that night at all. The footsteps receded into the oak trees, whose low-hanging branches shimmered and shook as the sounds dissipated past them. Then silence. The leaves stopped shaking too, and the street lamp flickered once or twice, but other than that there was nothing different than what would have been on any other night. "If you do that again, I'll call the police," I yelled into the darkness. Frustrated, I shut the door. Sleep did not come easily that night because I kept expecting another knock on the door. Perhaps out of spite of being yelled at, or a rock through the living room window as an act of defiance to my aggression, but no other sound came that night. The sounds of running footsteps across the lawn and into the trees could have been anything after all. This countryside was full of things, about which I knew next to nothing. The temperature of the room went back to its normal state too, and I finally sunk into a restless doze as the sun was coming up. I was awoken by a rapping at the front door, accompanied by a greeting in English with a heavy Norse accent. "Who is it?" I asked as I pulled on my trousers. "Caretaker," the voice on the other side of the door said. "Here to flush the pipes. Mr. Sven Skardsson said to." It was the caretaker. I had briefly read in an email from the owner that once a week a caretaker would come to the premises and flush the pipes. It was an old house, he said, and the pipes needed to be exercised so as to not have them clogged. "Oh, sorry, please," I said. I heard the sound of heavy boot-laden footsteps trudge away from the door and around the corner of the house. After washing my face with warm water and getting dressed, I went outside. I wanted to ask this caretaker if he knew of any incidents of late concerning teenage delinquency or the like that might help explain what had happened over the last few nights. "Be sure to keep your door locked tonight, sir," he said. "Yes," I replied. "I always do." He looked pointedly at me. "This is an old house, sir, and this is old land. Sometimes a wind blows in from the moors and brings things in with it. The house can get drafty, so you might hear or see things that you think are there but aren't. Best to keep it locked." "Why tonight?" I asked. "If you hear it again, ask it to knock again. 1 time if it's a man, and 2 times if it's a woman." "So this is a common thing? Someone knocking at your door late at night?" I asked. He swallowed and looked around nervously again. "After that, ask if it's young or old. 1 knock for young, 2 for old." "Ask it. Who's it? Why can't I just—" He held a stubby bony finger up to his lips. "Shh." He looked increasingly fretful. "The next question you should ask is if it's alone or not. 1 knock for alone and 2 knocks for not alone. You see?" I was beginning to think this old caretaker was insane. "What is this, a game?" I asked him. "These parts aren't like your country, sir," he said. "What happens after that?" I asked. He regarded me and my question for what seemed like longer than necessary. "Have you ever seen or heard birds around here, sir?" His English was limited, and my Norwegian was almost non-existent. I explained as best I could, but he understood. I knew he understood me, because his countenance changed as I was recalling what had happened. His face went from casual curiosity to an expression I can only describe as nervousness. He put his tools down and leaned in towards me. He looked around as if being watched by disapproving eyes. He was looking into the trees, startled a little as if being shaken out of his daydream. "That'll be enough," he said. "Wait, so this—" My question was cut off by a sudden violent howling wind through the trees. The caretaker was visibly shaken by this. "I'm sorry," he said. Then he ignored my presence altogether and frantically packed up his tools and ran for the front of the house where his van was parked. He threw his kit bag into the back of the van, took one last look back at the house and its surroundings, got into the driver's seat and sped off. The wind subsided as he sped off down the road. I looked around the lawn and the trees beyond. What had startled him? What was this silly game of knock-knock he wanted me to engage in? And with whom? It was all too weird for my liking. I had errands to run, and at that time of year the days were short, so I had to make the most of the daylight. I had no time for the superstitious ramblings of old Norwegian caretakers. The post office in town was a 15-minute bicycle ride away through the green countryside. The road was empty, save for a tractor which passed by, the driver of which eyed me suspiciously. Then I saw something up ahead on the side of the road. It was a van, and it was parked at an awkward angle. When I got closer, I recognized it as the caretaker's van, and the driver's side door was open. What's more, the keys were still hanging out of the ignition, the motor idling. However, the caretaker was nowhere to be seen. There was shrubbery on either side of the road, so he could have left his vehicle to go and relieve himself behind the shrubs. Either way, he had definitely been in a mad rush to get out of his van. I must have fallen into a deep sleep that night. I had stayed up reading, sat in a chair in the living room, and must have dozed off. Something must have awoken me. As I sat there, the first thing I heard was the wind outside, and then above it another sound. The sound of very heavy, slow footsteps approaching along the path towards the door. I sat bolt upright, straining my ears to hear. The footsteps continued until they reached the front door. My heart was in my throat and beating an erratic rhythm. I rose from the chair and tiptoed across the room, fearful that at any moment the door would burst open, even though I had it locked and bolted. Then with a loud click, the lights in the entire house went out. I was left in complete darkness, save for the weak moonlight oozing in from the living room window, which was opaque from the condensation. The next moment I could hear something else, a very faint scratching sound. I listened intently in the darkness, trying to determine the direction from which it was coming. It must be the branches scraping against each other in the wind, I thought, with relief. The scratching sound continued, and it was coming from the front door. It would start at the very top and then slowly descend to the bottom, and it was regular and deliberate. It was not the wind. I couldn't bear to stand there in the dark any longer, just listening to it. My hand reached the doorknob and the noise stopped. It was replaced by a single knock on the door. At that moment I thought I could hear breathing. I can't be completely certain that it was my own either. Then I remembered what the caretaker had told me, the questions he told me to ask should I hear knocking again tonight. In the suffocating darkness of the doorway I asked, "If you're a man, knock once. If you're a woman, knock twice." I felt like a fool. What was I even doing, standing there asking? Knock, knock. All the hairs on my body stood on end. My mouth was dry, and in my ears blood pounded furiously. The second question. "Are you young or old?" 1 for young, 2 for old. The sound of the wind. Then, Knock. I felt like I was in someone else's nightmare. I asked the third question. Are you alone, or are you more than one? 1 knock for alone, and 2 if there's somebody with you. There was an extremely painful pause. The silence went on for too long. Knock, 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 knock. Then the sound of hundreds of fists violently beating on the door. The door shook on its hinges, threatening to rip itself away under the force of the beating on the other side. The lights in the house flickered on and off, almost in sync with the thunderous bashing of 1,000 tiny hands on the hardwood door. I fell to the ground and squirmed backwards away from it and whatever nightmare lay beyond it. The banging continued. In a frenzy of panic and fear, I scrambled to my feet and ran across the living room and into the kitchen. As I reached for the door handle, the same sound of hands banging on the door exploded from the other side. Both the front and kitchen doors were roaring with the sounds of drums, all beating. At this point I vomited from panic. It poured out of my mouth and onto the kitchen floor and made my eyes sting. I made for the bedroom, not being able to navigate by my eyes due to the darkness and the tears. I slipped on something which smelled acidic, like bile, and landed on my elbow. The pain shot through me like a bullet. I pushed myself up in a puddle of my own vomit and lunged at the bedroom. Behind me the doors kept rattling and roaring with the banging of the hands. I wrenched up the bedroom window and leapt out into the dark. I landed on the soft grass with a breathtaking thud which knocked what little wind was in me out. I caught my breath looking up at the branches of the willow and oak overhead. There was no sound coming from the open window. There was no sound at all after that. Even the wind had stopped. It was like a vacuum of life. Nothing existed except my own laboured breathing. Looking up at the window, I saw them. Handprints, hundreds of them, all sizes, peppered over the window from the inside. I crawled away for a time and then got up and ran. I never did return to that house, not even for my passport. I applied at the consulate for a new one. My phone, any cash that I had, and all other personal effects were left behind. I spent the next day at a bus depot in town, where I had wandered in barefoot. Someone was good enough to give me some coins to use a payphone, with which I called an English-speaking Airbnb agent on, who was kind enough to come and pick me up. She thought I had taken an overdose of something, such was my state. Eventually I got into contact with my parents back in Australia, and with the help of the consulate I was able to get passage home. There was something I did in my life that I am not proud of. Well, there are a few, but this I've kept from sharing because I am ashamed. Only a few loved ones and the people who were involved know about it. Let me start by telling you that I worked hard for everything I have. I would sometimes paint the insides of apartments, and I did maintenance jobs for a real estate company with my son on my hip because his father refused to watch him. He came into the relationship with only one box. Am I bitter? A bit, but I have learned to let it all go. The following story happened in Lancaster, California in 1997. I moved to an apartment with my youngest son and his father, Kev. Things were pretty good, or so I thought, until they weren't. Kev started his drinking again and hanging out with his brothers and friends. He would stay out for days at a time and would sometimes come home accusing me of cheating. Life sucked. Now I had been paying for a storage unit for years, and it held all the memories of my family and my other children from a time we once had together. It was very important to me. My car had been stolen prior to moving in, so I had to depend on Kev and his family to take my money and pay the bills. The last few months before I left him, he was acting erratic, more so than usual. He had started using drugs, and it just became a way of life with him. One night I was making dinner, and I heard something outside. It was my name being called. I looked out of the living room window, and to my surprise, our quiet street was bustling with commotion. Red and blue flashing lights filled the night, and there he stood, in the middle of the street, yelling my name. An officer came to my door before I could even run out there. He said, "Excuse me, ma'am, do you want to come out and claim your car? If you don't, it will be towed." What? What the hell was he talking about? Apparently his brother had taken my car and was keeping it at his mother's house for Kev. and now Kev is outside telling the sheriffs that it's my car. He'd stashed drugs inside of it, and the cops had found them. He was trying to pin the rap on me. Thankfully, the officer believed me, and Kev was sent back to prison. So there I sat, alone and in shock. But to add insult to injury, the landlord showed up days later, telling me that the rent hasn't been paid in 4 months, and there has been no response to letters that I had never even received, so I had to be out in 10 days. That wasn't even enough time to move my stuff. The utilities were shut off soon after that, and then I found out that he'd taken every cent that I had put away. My world was upside down, and I felt completely crushed. I had nowhere to go, and I couldn't move to my mother's because, well, it was complicated. Plus I had prior commitments in Lancaster. I temporarily moved my son and I in with a friend. I needed time to heal from this, but I soon found out she was selling drugs. At first we were fine. We kept to ourselves and away from that lifestyle, but my depression kicked in and the temptation to make the pain go away was too strong. I called my mother and asked her to come get my son, as I didn't want him to be around that stuff, so she came and got him. I didn't want any of my kids to see me like that. I was a mess. My self-esteem was at the lowest it had ever been. How could I have been such a fool? Every time I drove past my boarded-up apartment with my belongings in it, it was a constant reminder. One day my friend went and picked up my mail from that place, and there it was, the nail in my coffin. He stopped paying my storage, and it was up for auction for way too much money. That was it. Now I've lost the last thing I was holding on to. Something just flipped in my mind. I was told that I dropped the letter and walked out of the house in my bare feet, wearing just a long t-shirt in the freezing weather. I walked over to the mini-mart and made a big cup of cocoa and walked out without paying. My friend saw me though and paid for it. Later she found me sitting in the park just staring at nothing. Man, I was in a bad place. I couldn't bring myself to call my children or my mother and tell them that everything the kids had from their childhoods was now gone. Now this is what I'm not proud of. I felt in my sick head that my children were better off without me. I told my friends that I was off to see my family, and I parked my car 2 blocks away in an alley and broke into my old apartment with the boarded-up windows. I went into the back so nobody would notice, and I sat down on my couch. The room was lit up from only one candle with a book in front of it as to not cast any shadows, and I wrote a farewell letter to my family. First to my children, each and every one of them, telling them how they should be there for each other, to not be like me and to do great things with their lives. Then a letter to my mother, telling her what a wonderful job she had done raising me, and how sorry I was for falling short and hurting her so many times. On every page the ink was bleeding where the wrinkled pages were soiled by my tears. I had enough pills in my hand to kill a horse. Then I put them in my mouth and waited. The room was dark and cold, and there was nothing left in me. This was it. My stomach felt like it was burning, and my eyes started to get heavy. I was alone. I started to fade out, but then jolting awake, I looked around and my eyes began to focus. There were people in the room with me, walking back and forth in front and behind me, like they didn't know I was there. There was no colour in the room, and I reached out my arm in front of me, trying to touch them, but I was just waving my hand through air. Just then this lady stopped and stood there, still facing the direction she was walking. I believe I muttered, "What are you?" At least that's what I heard come from my mouth. She turned her head and looked straight at me and screamed a blood-curdling scream, then went back to walking. At this point my body is still sitting up, but slumped into the couch. It felt like my eyes were rolling into the back of my head, and I got nudged on my chest near my shoulder. "Wake up," he said. He was stern. "It isn't your time." He was wearing a trench coat and everything was grey. My head fell back down and he nudged me again, only harder. "It's not your time," he repeated, then a hard slap to my face. It felt like cold air on my neck. There were then hands on both my shoulders, shaking me, causing my head to flop from side to side. Then I passed out. I woke up to fingers down my throat and me gasping for air. It was a girl I had met only twice. She said she'd gotten a feeling I was here and I needed help. She said that she couldn't shake the feeling for hours and that she had never felt anything like it before, so she didn't understand why she was there. She told her friend he needed to break in the door, but he was so scared of getting in trouble. He said when he'd gotten there he felt the same thing as she was feeling. I will forever be grateful to her for saving me and to the man for trying to shake me awake until help arrived. And you know, life got better after that. I worked things out in my head and I got away from that life and those people. I learned that you can't do it alone, but we can do it together. I tried to solve a temporary problem with a permanent solution. I found the letters I had written years later and it filled me with shame. The mental problems that would have caused my family. What a selfish act. If anyone out there is suffering and it feels like there is no way out, there is, believe me. Stop pushing your loved ones away. They may not understand what you are going through, but they can listen. And if you still feel nobody hears you, please get help. Only time reveals the answers. I lived on a 1.5 acre piece of land in an old shack type of house. It had 3 bedrooms and 1 bathroom. It was a simple and small house. The living room was to the right, the kitchen and back door to the left, the 2 bedrooms and the bathroom between them, and a door from the living room that went straight back into the 3rd bedroom. That last bedroom I was using as a storage room, as I had no garage, and it was filled with boxes of my stuff. I had accumulated quite a few friends over the years, from all walks of life. I wasn't working at the time and they knew my door was always open, just to say hi, to stay and have a coffee, or just if they wanted to play a few card games. It almost felt like my home was a hub for everyone to just leave their problems on the doorstep, come in and relax for a moment. We even had a projector screen and would display movies some nights on the wall of this 2-story building next door. It was a fun time. Well, I never discriminated. If you were hungry or tired or needed a shower, my home welcomed you. Be kind to me and I would be kind to you, sort of thing. We even got raided a few times as the cops thought we were selling drugs because of all the activities going on, but they were sadly mistaken. One day a friend showed up, accompanied by this guy that I remember having very kind eyes, but he seemed to be very sad inside. He was hungry, so I made him some lunch. He was a great conversationalist, and we all laughed for hours and hours together. My friend had said that he didn't know the guy that well, but he seemed nice enough. He kept regularly complimenting me, a lot, which of course made me uncomfortable, so I politely asked him to stop. He came back a few more times with his friend, but one time by himself. I didn't mind though, as I was never really alone with him. Time went on and he just stopped coming altogether. I didn't think anything of it really. People move on. After a while of living there, things started to feel strange in that house. Even when I was alone, it didn't feel like it. Things started to feel off as things were being moved. A few dishes were not where they were supposed to be in the cabinet, and my bathroom mat was wet when I hadn't even showered. I made sure every time that I left the house that I locked things up and that I had the only key. My friends definitely thought I was losing it. It was now close to Christmas, so we put up a tree and everyone had a chance to put something on it when they came over. It was delightful. But soon after, the feelings of concern all flooded back when the candy canes started to disappear from the tree and the ornaments were rearranged every other day. What the hell was going on? A few days later, we had a small get-together. It was just some close friends from out of town. We'd all gotten a little tipsy, so I told them they could sleep over. My friend Tom and his girlfriend were in the other bedrooms, and his sister was on the couch in the living room. The next morning I was up first, and when I went to make coffee, I asked Tom's sister if she'd slept well. No, not at all, that jerk. Now I laughed because I thought she was joking, but she'd been alone in the room. Who could she be mad at? She said her brother Tom was snoring all night, but just then Tom's girlfriend came out of the room saying, "What are you talking about? He doesn't snore, but I heard it too." I put my hands up and said that my door had been shut and I didn't hear anything. Later we were all eating breakfast, and Tom's sister asked him how he could eat so much with everything he'd eaten whilst everyone was sleeping. We all looked at each other like she was crazy. "Sis, I didn't get out of bed last night." She argued that somebody, a man, had gone into the kitchen and gotten food, then gone out the back. Then whoever this man was had come back in and stood in front of the couch sucking on a candy cane, before going back to bed. Tom and his girlfriend insisted that it was not him. The house didn't feel haunted, but maybe it was. Tom shared his concerns with me being here alone, and to be honest, I was pretty freaked out at that point. Word had gotten out that Tom was in town, so it wasn't long before some friends had come over to visit. They were only there for about 30 minutes when Tom asked us all to go outside and check something out in his car. I was in the middle of doing things, but he pointedly put my arm in his hand and looked at me straight in the eyes and said, "You have to see too," whilst leading me out the door. Once we'd all gotten outside, Tom turned to all of us and told us not to go back inside the house. Then 2 of his friends grabbed big sticks and followed Tom back into my home. Suddenly I heard yelling and a crash. I ran to my door, but Tom's girlfriend stopped me. Soon after they came out dragging a strange man with them. It was that guy with kind eyes. I didn't understand what was happening. Tom said that he'd been able to put 2 and 2 together with all the things that I'd told him that was going on, and when he was standing by the bedroom door, near the living room, he could smell urine, so he went around the back and looked through the slats in the bedroom window and saw a man hiding under my boxes. He must have been eluding me for weeks. The sheriffs were called and they told Tom that they had been looking for that guy in connection to other crimes. To think that guy was just feet away from me, eating my food, probably watching me sleep and God knows what else when I wasn't home, is terrifying. What were his plans and why was he there? After that day I changed the locks and got a dog. And if you're reading this, thank you, Tom. I want to apologise to any one of my family members who might think I am implying that this thing was in any way my sister. My sister was unique, very funny, special, and the most loving person you could meet, but she had a very dark side, and we all knew that. My sister was the eldest of 6, 5 girls and 1 boy. She had a spirit friend at a young age and would have quite intelligent conversations with her. My mother even asked her to ask her friend things she would never have known the answer to at that age, and it floored my mother when she gave her friend's very mature response. She told me later that she'd felt like her friend was always there because she'd needed her at the time. After she grew older, her friend told her it was time for her to go. She'd lived through the hardest of times with my mother and her very abusive marriages, divorces, and ever-changing locations and lifestyles. In some ways, I think it made my sister feel very protective over our mum, almost borderline obsessive, doing anything in her power to get my mother's approval, even if it meant hurting one of us. In some ways, we believed she resented us for taking mum's attention. I think she resented my brother the most for being the only boy of the family and getting all the praise that came with that role. It broke my mother's heart when he got married and moved away. So needless to say, my sister wasn't too fond of his wife and made every attempt to distance my mother and his relationship. After my brother had left, her resentment then moved on to our second eldest sister, because she was always trying to get attention by causing trouble, which carried on into adulthood, resulting in causing a lot of stress for our mother. Then there was me, and because I was the baby of the family, my mother and I had a special bond that nobody could break. My sister had always been a little unstable, but then there was a shift. Things changed after the house on Alexandria, and I slept with my mother whilst there. I remember that night after night she would sit on the edge of my mother's side of the bed, projecting negativity and expressing delusional problems for things that hadn't even happened, until my mother would cry for her to stop. It could have been that something had attached itself to her there, but I don't know. Fast forward to the end of my sister's life. My mother passed away at the age of 87 from cancer, leaving my sister feeling alone and not wanting to live anymore. She would never take her own life, but she longed to be with our mother in the afterlife very badly. She had been suffering for a long time with her own medical issues while Mum was still alive, but now she felt like there was nothing left to fight for, so if she just stopped her treatments, the end would come eventually. We all tried to bring her home with us, but she just wasn't having it. She also suffered from paranoia, and she wanted to stay in that cold, empty place. She would just sit there holding Mum's things while staring off into the distance, like she was just simply waiting. I was there one night helping, like many nights before, when she asked me to come and sit close to her. She said it was very important, so I moved closer. She told me that she was worried. She was at the end of her life and she felt like she needed my forgiveness. She said that she had done things, bad things. I told her that we've all done things we're not proud of, but she insisted that what she had done was not good and it had manipulated many of the outcomes in my life. She looked very worried, but she would not tell me what those things were. I'm pretty sure I already knew, and they did have an impact on my life in a negative way. She said that for many years she had felt a dark presence clouding her thoughts. She opened her hand and spread her fingers, then hovered her hand over the top right side of her head and said, "Right here." I had always felt something around her as well, but I'd only told my mother about my concerns. At the end of her days she suffered greatly. I wasn't there when she passed as I was 2 states away, so one of my sisters sent me a picture of her in her final days. She was propped up in her hospital bed with her eyes wider than I've ever seen them before, staring up to the right above her head, right where she said she'd felt that negative dark presence. This was not just a glazed stare. This looked like straight up fear. I called and asked the nurse how long she had been staring like that, and they told me that it had been so long that they'd started using eye drops so her eyes wouldn't dry out. What was she looking at? It still haunts me to this day. The night she passed it was late, so I waited until the morning to tell my brother. He didn't seem surprised and asked me what time she took her last breath, as he had a feeling. With that I replied, "How so?" He proceeded to tell me that after he'd turned the lights off and closed his eyes, something dark rushed at him. He said it was cold and frightening, and all of a sudden her face came to his mind and it felt like her. He just knew she had passed. Man, did that ever freak me out. A few days later, my second to eldest sister and my brother's ex-wife, they lived together, called me telling me that things crashed in their bathroom at 5 a.m. and the dog wouldn't stop growling at the top corners of the room. Now I'm thinking that maybe I'm next, but nothing happened. Almost a week went by, and I'm lying in bed with my grandchildren asleep with me. My grandson looked up towards my bedroom door and said, "Spooky." I didn't even look. I told him that it was all right and that the bed was covered in white light and we were protected. I moved my hand as if I had a magic wand and was covering us like a blanket. He sat up and looked around and said, "Oh, thank you," and went off to sleep. I joined him. My son and his fiancée, on the other hand, did not sleep at all that night. Now I keep a very bright nightlight on in my room, so there was no explanation for this. I live in an old farm-like house with a loft upstairs where my son has his room. The door to the stairs go into the kitchen that is facing my room. My son said that he and his fiancée came downstairs to the kitchen. They both looked towards my room to see if I was up, but in the doorway, what they saw, as they had described it, was a light absorbing darkness. They both stood there in disbelief, stricken with fear, trying to see into my room. It was almost as if whatever it was couldn't get in there, but it was standing just feet from my bed. It stayed there for a while, then went away. Later that month, my grandchildren and I drove down to my mother and sister's home to put all of their remaining belongings into storage, and that's when we were met with that same darkness that shook us to the core. It left me questioning life events from the past. Was it this thing that made her that way? And did it have a hand in changing the course of our lives? Or was what we saw in that house something else altogether? I hope she finds peace. I find it strange that everyone in my family in one way or another has experienced something warm and loving with my mother. A touch on the hand, a stroke on the cheek or back, followed sometimes by the smell of her perfume. But no one at all has been visited, and it breaks my heart to think that we don't really know what is on the other side. Is she being held somewhere and we can't help her? Or did she just simply move on? I hope it's the latter. Someone brought something up that really made me think, and I have to agree. He'd said that it sounded like it lost your sister when she died. That's why it's been showing up at other family homes. It was looking for a new host, but it seemed none of you were in a dark enough place for it to force an attachment. When she'd passed, one of my sisters stayed, whispering spiritual affirmations, quietly suggesting she go into the light, until she was gone. And that gave me peace.